In this tutorial we'll take a look at the blurs that are built into Mamba. The master blur node is under Effects and Blur here. In fact, Grow Shrink, Blur Alpha and Blur Foreground are actually all parts of this master blur. They're just repeated here just for ease of access on the interface. So we'll add a blur to this shot and double click to get the parameters. So we can choose what sort of blur we're going to add, and we can choose how that blur gets applied, and then we can choose what the extent of that blur is and whether we need to deal with any non-spherical lenses. So the fastest blur is the box blur, and it takes very little processing. As you can see, it's running real time pretty easily on that. The downside of the box blur is, as you can see, the blur is quite rough because it's effectively blurring in X and Y only. If we switch to the Gaussian blur, then you can see the result is a lot smoother. This actually theoretically takes a little longer to process, although it's still real time on this one. The next one is a circle blur that gives you a more lens-like blur. And then there's median, which isn't like a normal blur. It basically brings together tones that are similar. So the more you wind it up, the less different tones you get in the image. And you can see everything takes on quite a painted look. We can also use Grow and Shrink, which expand the bright areas and compress the dark areas, as you can see. And of course Shrink goes the other way. At the moment the mode is set to RGB, meaning that I'm blurring the red, green and blue channels. Alternatively, I could just blur, for example, just the color channels, or perhaps just the green channel. The blurs can also be set to work with the alpha channel, and the RGB in alpha and RGB radius of alpha are two modes where the blur itself is controlled by the incoming alpha channel. So I'm just going to insert into here a quick wipe pattern, because a wipe with one input will just appear on the alpha channel like that. I'm just going to blur that off a little, make it bigger. So normally in RGB mode the blur will happen over the whole image. If I set the mode to RGB in alpha, what we can see is that effectively what we've got are two images, a sharp image and a blurred image, and then the alpha channel is keying between the two. That's why we can see some fuzziness in this area. It's because we're seeing a semi-transparent sharp version and a semi-transparent blurred version over the top. A slightly different way of doing the similar thing is to use RGB radius of alpha. What this does is, rather than mix between a blurred version and a sharp version, instead the blur is actually driven by the strength of the alpha channel. So you can see there's a soft gradation where along the edge of that mat the image is getting more and more blurred. So that's the difference between RGB radius of alpha and RGB in alpha. To play with the other modes, I'm just going to very quickly put together a very simple green screen. I won't try too hard. I'll do for the purposes of playing with the blurs. And in fact, just to make it clearer, I'm just going to kill the hue suppression to put the green back in. So in this case, I'll put the blur in line after the green screen. So at this point, the blur also has an incoming alpha channel. So this way we can see a couple of the other modes. So at the moment we're in RGB. So if I were to pull a blur, we can see that we're blurring the foreground, but we're not blurring the edge of the mat. If we wanted to blur the edge of the mat as well, we could use RGBA. And that will do both together, or just the alpha on its own. Of course, the problem in this particular scenario where we have a green screen, or where we're doing some compositing, where something is cut from a different background, is that if we do blur the foreground image, then of course the foreground image is being mixed with the background that we're strictly speaking trying to lose. We can see as we blur we're getting in the green halo in this particular case. So that's actually specifically what This version is for blur foreground. When I click it on, you can see that the blur is recorrected so that the foreground is correctly blurred against the background it's being keyed over rather than its original background. At the moment, this blur is happening in every direction equally. We can also make it go in an elliptical fashion one way or the other just by sliding this around. Apart from this master blur node, there are a couple of other types of blur within Mamba. Here's a directional blur, so this very simply has an amount and an angle to give you motion blur style effects. So this is quite a good one for making camera shakes and that sort of thing. We could just go to math, put in a random number from 0 to 360 as the angle, and you can see that that's created a curve and give that a little bit of value in terms of the amount of the blur, and then very quickly we have an earthquake. Next blur down is radial blur. This allows us to create crash zoom style effects. So we can just move around the center and the values to make some wonderful effect. Sometimes I use this to generate light rays actually. So for example, make a duplicate of that. And we'll set that as a screen over that layer. So you get a kind of light ray kind of thing going on. There's also something called slope blur. This is a little bit more of a fun kind of thing, probably unlike any blur that you've used on anything else. So you just play around with the values, and it's a pattern that's generated based on the image itself. In addition to the static style blurs, there are also ones that are dynamically created from the image source. For example, optical motion blur. This will actually create a motion blur based on the motion within the frame. So you can see in this frame, everything that's moving has got a motion blur based on the direction of travel of the individual pixels, whereas those pixels that aren't moving don't have a blur. We can set the number of samples to change the quality of the blur, and also another useful function inside this optical flow blur is a shutter offset. So by doing this, I'm actually making a subframe difference to the offset of the clip. This is quite useful if you're having problems with, say, an HDRX dual track red image, where there's two exposures, a shorter exposure and a longer exposure that you bring together to make a high dynamic range image. You can apply this effect on one of the streams in order to retime the shutters together and also to match the motion blur. Then finally, there's one other type of blur, and that can be found inside the compositor. So if I just set up a very quick piece of animation, at the moment this has no motion blur at all, but within options, if we turn the samples up and set the shutter angle to something higher than 0, then Mamba will create the right amount of motion blur. For any given direction. So that was a quick roundup of all the blur effects that are built into Mamba.